Science versus Propaganda is a podcast challenging the pseudoscience, bad science, and the misrepresentation of science to advance reactionary agendas. In this episode, I investigate two seemingly respectable, middle-impact academic journals, which have allowed themselves to become the gateway through which white nationalist propaganda gains access to scientific credibility and distorts the scientific record. The most downloaded paper from the Elsevier journal, Personality and Individual Differences, is a 2012 paper by psychologists J. Philip Rushton and Donald Templer, linking aggression and sexuality to skin pigmentation in humans, with dark-skinned people being more aggressive and promiscuous than those with lighter skin, on the entirely false grounds that aggression and skin pigmentation are controlled by the same genes. The paper contained no new results. Instead, as demonstrated in an open letter to the editor of that journal, written by pseudonymous Twitter user and friend of the show EvoCiteGoogling, the proposed link was based on the misrepresentation of an earlier study on non-human animals. Whereas the authors of that original study point out that their results do not apply to humans, since differences in human skin pigmentation are mediated by variation in a completely different set of genes to those that were studied. Rushton and Templer reported that the original study's authors merely cautioned that such an association may not be consistently found in humans because of mutation. The latter account leaving the reader with the impression that the case for not drawing inferences about human racial differences rests on the possibility of an entirely hypothetical mutation making humans an exception to the rule, which would be a clear case of special pleading, rather than the truth, which is that it is a well-established fact that different genes are involved. The open letter also drew attention to the fact that Rushton and Templer's paper remains the most downloaded paper for the entire journal, not because of its fine contribution to the domain of scientific knowledge, but because of its widespread social media traction, being routinely posted to Chanboard, Stormfront, far-right blogs, and tweeted by alt-right social media personalities. Although the attention brought by this open letter, which went viral last year, produced many expressions of shock that such transparently racist garbage could ever get published in a serious academic journal, the sad truth is that this paper is in no way exceptional. Instead, in 2020, scientific racism of this kind is a thriving cottage industry, enthusiastically staffed by highly motivated hobbyists and fringe academics. And neither the abysmally poor quality nor odiously racist character of their work prove any major hurdle for the growth of this industry, whose customers are primarily far-right activists, alternative media, and the occasional conservative think tank. The scientific racists will, almost without exception, eagerly address white supremacist conferences and appear on alt-right podcasts, who in turn increasingly put the latest breakthroughs of scientific racism at the heart of their propaganda. Facts, as they say, cannot be racist. For example, Rushton and Templer were themselves regular contributors to the white nationalist magazine American Renaissance, and presented their research at its conferences. It has long been insisted by some that controversial ideas, such as racial differences, must be allowed to stand or fall on the basis of the evidence alone, and treated no differently to any other hypothesis. Scientists, they say, must not let what they would like to be true get in the way of discovering what really is true. The folly in all this is that scientific racism is not the result of good faith attempts by impartial researchers to test controversial hypotheses, to seek the truth no matter how uncomfortable it may be. Instead, as we shall see, scientific racism is a form of far-right political activism, a war of subversion waged not through street politics or electoral adventurism, but through the pollution of the scientific literature with phony data and junk theorizing, peer review being notoriously impotent when it comes to repelling willful fraud, hoaxes, or deliberate subterfuge. Their strategy is a simple one, but highly effective. First, our activists publish some doubtful research in one of their own pseudo-journals, like Mankind Quarterly, or in some pay-to-publish journal that is not affiliated with them, or they publish books in the vanity press or through white nationalist and neo-Nazi publishers. If the conclusion or the dataset it offers is tempting enough, then there's a chance that it will be cited by a paper published in a mid-tier journal, because the authors are either unaware of the unsafe origins of what they are citing, or they are willing to overlook such concerns provided it lends support to their pet hypothesis. Often, as was the case with Rushton and Templer's skin pigmentation paper, our activists will take care of this step themselves, especially those who have academic credentials, though it is usually more effective when the mule is not directly associated with them. The result, now published in an ostensibly legitimate journal, may well get reported on in newspapers of record, for it's likely to be provocative, or used as a source on Wikipedia, and is much more likely to get cited by papers in other legitimate journals, occasionally even the most prestigious of them. It is in this manner which flagrant bullshit manages to so deeply penetrate and corrupt the scientific record, spreading the acceptance of erroneous claims that are often difficult to trace back to their original source. In light of the symbiotic relationship between scientific racism and far-right extremism, and the enthusiasm with which far-right extremists consume this material, the consequences of this infiltration may be severe. Any number of mid-tier journals, most often, though not exclusively psychology journals, may serve this purpose. But two journals published by Elsevier, the giant of academic publishing, dominate this market. They are the journal Intelligence and the aforementioned Personality and Individual Differences. In order to examine how this strategy operates in practice, to gauge its potential efficacy and to get a sense of Elsevier's culpability, it's worth considering as a case study one of the most successful of these neo-racialist Trojan horses, the so-called National IQ research by Richard Lynn and Tatu Vanhanen. Richard Lynn is editor of Mankind Quarterly and succeeds Rushton as head of the Pioneer Fund, two Nazi-linked groups whose origins I have discussed in a YouTube video last year. And when I say Nazi-linked, I don't mean neo-Nazi. I mean linked to the actual Third Reich. You may remember Lynn as the man behind that hilariously bad penis length study, an obsession of both Rushton and Templer which he has inherited. If you have seen that video, then you already have an idea of the kind of junk science that we're in for. But in case you're not already familiar with that study, or in case you suspect there's a chance that his national IQ dataset will be of superior quality to his national penis size dataset, it's worth us taking a closer look. Lynn, with the help of his associate, has made it his avocation to calculate the average IQ of every nation on Earth, a list which he republishes with minor updates in a new book every few years. If you've ever come across a map that purports to show countries of the world by IQ, then you're familiar with this list at least in passing, with versions of it being reproduced in newspaper articles, on trivia websites, with those annoying online IQ quizzes that circulate on Facebook, and, of course, by YouTube videos with millions of views. The data was first published in a 2002 book called IQ and the Wealth of Nations, and has since been updated and republished in a number of follow-up books and articles, including the 2006 book IQ and Global Inequality, and the 2008 book The Global Bell Curve. Collectively, these books and articles have been cited literally thousands of times in academic journals. Sadly, despite the fact that most of these books were published by Washington Summit, the white nationalist publishing house published by Richard Spencer, most of these citations are not critical. But the sheer volume of references to this dataset affords us an opportunity to investigate through which avenues racialist pseudoscience marches on its journey to legitimization. Lynn's world map unapologetically follows the North American stereotypes that have become articles of faith for modern adherents of racial pseudoscience, with African countries scoring the lowest in IQ and East Asian countries the highest. And Lynn does not seem to have felt pressured into moderating his claims in the hope of maintaining a veneer of scientific plausibility. Instead, he goes all out, placing the IQs of African countries down in the 60s, with the lowest of all being a mere 59 for Equatorial Guinea. An IQ of 59 is nearly 3 standard deviations below the UK average of 100, meaning that out of 1,000 random Britons, only 1 or 2 might expect to be slightly lower than the average person from Equatorial Guinea in terms of IQ, while a 1 in 100 intellect from Equatorial Guinea would be comparable to a British person who leaves school without academic qualifications. Even people who entertain claims about racial intelligence differences, like those found in the bell curve, often struggle to take this seriously, as to do so would require believing that the average Central African would struggle to tie their own shoelaces. To explain our reported gap in national IQ so absurdly large seems to require one of 2 possibilities. Either IQ is not a good measure of innate cognitive ability, at least for purposes of international comparison, or Lynn's work with the data must be so fundamentally flawed as to render the output irredeemably worthless. As it turns out, both of these are the case. For 81 out of 185 countries, the national IQs have been calculated by collecting published results from earlier studies. But the studies used in these calculations are not generally large, carefully weighted samples. Instead, they tend to be studies looking at specific groups who were never intended to be representative of a wider population. For the African countries, data was often taken from studies on specific vocational groups like factory workers, or from school children living under apartheid. In one case, the author of the original study stressed that the IQ results were unreliable as none of the participants could speak fluent English. In another study used to calculate South Africa's national IQ, the original study's author makes clear that she had intentionally selected 4 children who were illiterate as part of a broader project aimed at studying how a society's shift from illiteracy to literacy affects cognitive reasoning, a research objective which rather foreshadows the more fundamental problem with Lynn's approach. Sleight of hand of this nature, in which an average IQ figure gets ripped out of context from a study which was concerned with the development of cognition among uneducated groups or under adverse conditions, is common practice for Lynn. In another African sample, this time for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a study was conducted on a hunter-gatherer tribe who had received no formal education whatsoever during the bloody Belgian occupation. The lowest scoring country on Lynn's list is Equatorial Guinea, with the lowly national IQ of 59. This figure is based on a single study, conducted on children who all had brain damage or severe mental disabilities. In Spain. Not only are the samples that find their way into Lynn's dataset not representative, they seem to have been chosen in a highly selective manner, so as to give Lynn the result he wants. With African countries studied, samples that had higher average IQ are ignored in favour of those performed on the illiterate or those with unassisted learning disabilities. With China, on the other hand, low-scoring samples from the poorer, less well-educated rural areas are ignored in favour of those conducted on middle-class college applicants and the like. Which brings me to another problem with Lynn's scores. In many cases, indeed in almost all large samples outside of the Western-educated, industrialised, rich democratic countries, the test results being used are not from a test which was intended to function as an IQ test, like the Wechsler or the Stanford Binet. Instead, they derive from tests designed to assess learned knowledge and acquired skills, and as such, tests on which we would expect performance to depend heavily on access to education. Now, so far everything I've said concerns only the 81 countries for which Lynn could find relevant data, or data that suits his agenda at any rate. But Lynn produces a national IQ figure for 185 countries. How does he reach conclusions about the remaining 104 countries for which he has no data? He simply takes an average of appropriate neighbouring countries, where a neighbouring country is deemed appropriate or not, depending on how Lynn classifies its racial composition. A procedure that seems to give him a great deal of freedom to include or exclude any figure he deems unsuitably high or low. In a few cases, national IQ is constructed from what Lynn describes as the known racial IQ. So Cape Verde, for instance, is said to be 1% white, 28% black, and 71% mixed. Each of these races is assigned a racial IQ based on Lynn's findings, with whites at 94, blacks at 66, and the mixed race population being assigned an IQ of 82 based on Lynn's interpretation of his data for what he describes as South African coloureds. These wild extrapolations sometimes involve more than one step, with Comoros assigned a national IQ based on that calculated for Madagascar, which in turn is derived by taking the average of Tanzania and the Philippines. Wow. As though the nonsensical way in which Lynn compiled these so-called national IQs isn't bad enough, as Jelte Wickerts and others have pointed out in a series of critical papers, the results of IQ tests cannot, even in principle, be used for cross-cultural comparisons such as those between industrialized and pre-industrialized societies. The skills and cognitive abilities that are assessed by formal testing are not equally valued or practiced in all societies. This fact is thought to be responsible for the Flynn effect, the tendency for average IQ scores to rise over time. As such, the results of these tests simply cannot be used to make the comparisons Richard Lynn wants to make. And yet, IQ and the Wealth of Nations has been cited 936 times according to Google Scholar. Its first two sequels, titled IQ and Global Inequality and Race Differences in Intelligence and Evolutionary Analysis, have 552 and 354 citations respectively. Derivative publications and more recent books by Lynn bring the total number of citations for this work to well over 2,000, though not all of these are unique. Many of these citations are in highly reputable journals like The Lancet, and these books aren't just being cited as filler in the background section either. One illustrative example comes from a paper published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, a leading journal in the life sciences. Titled Parasite Prevalence and the Worldwide Distribution of Cognitive Ability, the authors of the paper use Lynn's national IQ dataset alongside data on worldwide parasite prevalence to support their hypothesis that the Flynn effect, that is, the gradual increase in IQ test results in industrialized countries, is caused by a decrease in intensity of infectious diseases as nations develop. Use like this, as a convenient dataset for quick and dirty science, is typical of the papers citing Lynn's data in the more reputable journals, and this paper serves to illustrate the appeal of crank race science to mainstream researchers, provided it's packaged in a sufficiently tempting form. But most of the books and articles churned out by cranks like Lynn don't find their way to being directly cited in the pages of leading journals. More often, their route to infecting the mainstream is rather more windy and requires crossing a stepping stone or two. These stepping stones take the form of mid-tier journals, with a respectable impact factor, known names on their editorial board, and the appearance of meaningful peer review. And if we wish to know which journals make the most convenient stepping stones, we need to look no further than the citations for Lynn's book, half of which, after discounting books and non-reviewed articles, come from papers published in one of two journals, Elsevier's Intelligence and Elsevier's Personality and Individual Differences. The latter of these you will recognise as the journal that published the paper linking skin pigmentation and aggression. But this isn't even that bad by the standards of this journal. For example, the very next issue contains a paper titled The Decay of Western Civilization, Double Relaxed Darwinian Selection, in which its author, Helmuth Nyborg, who sits on the editorial board of Mankind Quarterly, argues that low fertility among high IQ Western populations, combined with what he describes as super fertile, low IQ non-Western immigration, will lead to the destruction of Western civilization. This was one of two papers in the same issue to deal with the topic the journal's editor describes as dysgenic fertility, a topic get revisited a year later in an issue alongside my favourite paper of all time, Richard Lynn's paper claiming to have found empirical evidence supporting Rushton's theory that racial IQ and penis length are inversely proportional, based on self-report data collated by a novelty website. On average, the journal seems to publish a paper on racial IQ differences, their universality and genetic origin, roughly once an issue, routinely from authors associated with Richard Lynn, Mankind Quarterly, or other white nationalists, being outdone in this regard perhaps only by its sister journal, Intelligence. The racist nonsense published in Intelligence strikes a broadly similar tone to that published in Personality and Individual Differences, but perhaps the most remarkable is the now infamous paper that assumed the Earth was flat. In 2008, Satoshi Kanazawa published the paper Temperature and Evolutionary Novelty as Forces Behind the Evolution of Genetic Intelligence, which took Lynn's IQ data and demonstrated a positive correlation with two geographic factors, distance from East Africa and national mean annual temperature, the latter also being sourced from the appendix of one of Lynn's books. On this basis, Kanazawa concluded that two theories of the evolution of differential racial intelligence were both empirically supported, this being Lynn's called Winter's theory, which predicts that intelligence evolved as a response to greater selection pressure in the harsh winters of the North, and Kanazawa's own evolutionary novelty theory, which argues that intelligence evolved as a response to new environments as humans migrated out of Africa. And it's the latter of these arguments that presents the greatest cause for hilarity, and clear proof that no serious effort is being made to check the papers for errors. The moment we take a clear look at this argument, even a child can see the problems with it. You see, Kanazawa's argument is that since his theory predicts increases in intelligence as a response to new environments, that IQ should be correlated with distance travelled from sub-Saharan Africa. While this argument itself is entirely spurious, after all, the people in Africa didn't stop evolving, Africa's environment has never stopped changing, and people move around in Africa all the time, to name but a few obvious objections. The real fun begins when we look at how Kanazawa measured distance from sub-Saharan Africa. He did so by measuring the distance along a straight line, and calculated the length of this line by applying Pythagoras' theorem to the difference in longitude and the difference in latitude. This has some problems. First, it assumes that Paleolithic humans swam across oceans to get to distant continents rather than following known migration patterns. Second, it tests predictions that ought to apply to natives of the Americas, Australia, etc., against the present-day populations of these countries. Finally, by calculating the distance travelled by recording latitude and longitude, and then applying Pythagoras' theorem, he not only ended up with the wrong answer, he implicitly assumed that the Earth is flat. In fact, the paper was so bad that it led to several of the older members of Intelligence's editorial board taking to other journals to complain about the editorial practices of the current management, a management which had recently invited Richard Lynn himself, along with a couple of Pioneer funder Mankind Quarterly buddies, to join the editorial board. After this incident, Lynn was quietly removed from the editorial board of Intelligence, though some of his colleagues remain, and Lynn and several other far-right activists remain on the board of Personality and Individual Differences, a journal in which Kanazawa was permitted to publish a follow-up paper reiterating his hypothesis, in the very same issue, as it happens, as that Decay of Western Civilization paper. Now, Kanazawa, as you may have guessed from his name, is probably not a white nationalist, though he does move in the same circles, and he is most certainly both a racialist and a racist, not to mention a misogynist and all-round wackadoodle. Instead, I bring up this paper to illustrate the point that, providing your paper helps to advance the racialist views of its editorial staff, you need not fear being held to even minimal standards of rigour at these journals. And this gets at the key point I'd like you to take away from this. Scientific racism, is not a good faith attempt to follow empirical facts into politically controversial territory. It's a well-organized, highly coordinated attempt to subvert academic institutions by politically motivated far-right activists. Thank you for listening. And thanks to all my patrons, especially James Lingford, Julie, Joe Boyle, Lanry Joseph, and Kale Lapala. I hope I pronounced that last one right. If you'd like to support the show, please consider sharing on social media, or even supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/science versus propaganda. That's science vs propaganda. See you next time.